You actually think anyone here doesn't know exactly who you are? Emma? Ryan's voice cut across the entire ballroom. Sharp, deliberate, loud enough to turn heads from every corner of the room. He smiled like a man who'd been rehearsing this moment for years. A waitress who got lucky. That's all you ever were. The room went silent. And Damien Russo, the man standing beside Emma, the man whose name alone made city officials lose sleep, slowly turned his head toward Ryan Whitmore. He didn't speak. Not yet. But his eyes said everything. If you've ever watched someone realize in real time that they've just made the worst mistake of their life, that's exactly what happened next. Stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. Emma Carter had not planned on attending the Meridian Foundation Gala. She had 4 other obligations that Thursday evening, a board call at 7, a follow-up with her legal team at 8, and a private dinner she'd promised Damien 2 weeks ago and already rescheduled twice. Her assistant Priya had flagged the gala invitation the moment it arrived and asked the obvious question, did Emma want to decline politely, or did she want Priya to handle it entirely, so it disappeared from her calendar without a trace? Emma had said she'd think about it. Then she found out Ryan Whitmore was the keynote speaker. She went, not for revenge. She'd examined that word from every angle over the years, and she knew with genuine certainty that revenge was not what she felt. Revenge required you to still care what the other person thought of you. Revenge required that their opinion still had weight. Emma had shed that particular burden a long time ago in a hospital corridor on a Tuesday night, standing beside her mother's bed with $43 in her checking account and a voicemail from Ryan. She had not yet opened because some part of her already knew what it would say. She went to the gala because she was a board member of the Meridian Foundation, and board members attended. That was the whole reason. Clean. Professional. Final. She told herself that 3 times on the drive over. Damien listened to her say it the 3rd time and said nothing. He reached across the center console and put his hand over hers, and the gesture was so quiet and so certain that Emma felt the tension she hadn't admitted she was carrying loosen slightly in her chest. You don't have to explain yourself to me, he said. I'm not explaining myself, I'm thinking out loud. You've been thinking out loud for 40 minutes. That's called processing. Call it whatever you want. He squeezed her hand once. We go in. We stay as long as you want. We leave the moment you're ready. That's it. That's the whole plan. Emma looked out the window at the hotel entrance at the line of black cars and the men and women in evening wear moving through the lit glass doors, and she thought not for the first time that she had built an entirely different life than the one she was supposed to have. She had built it deliberately, brick by brick, in the years after Ryan. She had clawed and scraped and worked until her hands shook and her eyes burned, and her mother, even from a hospital bed, had looked at her and said, "Baby, you are going to be extraordinary." Her mother had been right. But walking into a room where Ryan Whitmore was about to be celebrated for his generosity and leadership, that still cost Emma something. She wouldn't pretend it didn't. The cost was small, much smaller than it once would have been, but it was real. She took a breath. She opened the car door herself before the valet could reach it. "Let's go," she said. The Valentina Hotel's grand ballroom had been renovated 3 times in the past decade, and each renovation made it more aggressively impressive than the last. Higher ceilings, more marble crystal fixtures that caught the light and threw it back at you in ways that felt almost accusatory, as though the room itself was demanding that you justify your presence. It was the kind of space that made people walk differently. Straighter spines, slower movements, every gesture suddenly performed for an invisible audience. Emma had been inside rooms like this enough times now that the effect had worn off. She moved through the crowd the way she moved through everything, purposefully, without rushing, with the particular quality of attention she'd developed over years of learning to read people quickly and accurately. She spotted Ryan before he spotted her. How was holding court near the bar, a small group orbiting around him, the way small groups always orbited around men who projected easy confidence. He had the kind of face that photographed well and aged generously, strong jaw, good teeth, the practiced warmth of someone who understood the transaction of charm. He was wearing a tuxedo that cost more than Emma's mother's monthly medical bills used to. He was laughing at something one of the orbiting men had just said, and the laugh was perfectly calibrated, present, but not excessive, warm, but not ingratiating. Emma watched him for exactly 3 seconds before he felt her gaze the way people sometimes do, the way the back of the neck picks up attention before the conscious mind registers it. Ryan turned. He saw her, and something happened in his face that Emma caught before he could correct it. A flicker of genuine surprise, quickly followed by something more complicated. Something she recognized as the particular discomfort of a person confronting evidence that a story they told themselves was not entirely true. Then the discomfort was gone, and the smile was back. The good smile. The performance. He excused himself from his group. He walked toward her. Emma did not take a single step in his direction. Emma Carter. He said her name like it was a punchline he'd been saving. Like the mere fact of her presence here in this room, in this dress, with her hair done and her shoulders back, was the setup for a joke only he understood. I did not expect to see you tonight. Ryan. Her voice was flat and polite, and gave him absolutely nothing. He glanced at Damien with the particular glance men gave other men when they were trying to establish a hierarchy, quick assessing, dismissive. Damien returned the look with no expression at all, which was, Emma knew, the most unsettling possible response. So, Ryan said, returning to Emma. You look... He paused theatrically, performing consideration. Different. Time tends to do that. No, I mean really different. I barely recognized you. He tilted his head. Is that what money does to a person? Or is it... And here he gestured vaguely at Damien, at the space between them. The right company. Emma heard the ripple of awareness move through the people nearby. A few conversations slowed. A few heads turned. She had spent enough years reading rooms to know when someone was playing to an audience, and Ryan was playing to this one, positioning himself, making her the object of examination, inviting everyone within earshot to remember that he knew her from before, and that before was something she should be embarrassed about. She also knew with absolute certainty that he had done this on purpose. He had walked across this room on purpose. He had said her name that loudly on purpose. He had arranged his expression and selected his words and timed this moment, all on purpose. Ryan Whitmore had not stumbled into this interaction. He had been waiting for it. That knowledge settled something in Emma. Not anger. Clarity. I'm doing well, Ryan, she said. Thank you for asking. He laughed. I didn't ask. I know, but you were thinking it. The people nearby didn't laugh, but Emma caught the small shift in their energy, the almost imperceptible tilt toward her, the recalibration. Ryan caught it too. His jaw tightened by a fraction. Still sharp, he said. I always liked that about you. He made the compliment sound like the opposite of a compliment. Though I remember a time when sharp was all you had, before... He paused again. Another theatrical pause. Everything else. Damien spoke for the first time. He said, Is there something you need from us? His voice was quiet, not hostile, not aggressive. The kind of quiet that is its own form of pressure, the way the silence before a storm is not actually silent at all. Ryan looked at him. I'm sorry. You walked across the room to speak to my wife, Damien said. I'm asking if there's something you need. I'm just saying hello to an old friend. She didn't look like she was waiting for your hello. Ryan's smile stayed in place, but his eyes changed. The easy assurance drained from them by a degree, and what replaced it was not quite fear, not yet, but the first distant awareness that he might have misread the situation. We go way back, Ryan said. Emma and I, don't we? Emma? Emma looked at him steadily. You broke up with me in a voicemail, she said, while my mother was in the ICU. The room went quieter. Ryan's smile didn't waver. Credit where credit was due, he had a remarkable ability to hold his expression under pressure. That was a long time ago. People are young. They make mistakes. You're right, you did. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. I see you've developed a little edge. It was always there. Emma kept her voice even, unhurried. You just didn't look closely enough to see it. Ryan excused himself 20 minutes later, after two more attempts to steer the conversation toward territory that positioned Emma as someone who'd needed rescuing from poverty, from obscurity, from her own limitations, and Emma had redirected both attempts so efficiently that the small audience around them had shifted fully in her direction, the way audiences always shifted toward whoever was actually winning. He left. Emma exhaled. Not relief exactly. More like the release of a breath she'd been regulating very carefully for 20 minutes. She reached for a glass from a passing tray and drank something sparkling and cold, and tried to feel what she actually felt, which was complicated. Damien put his hand at the small of her back. "You good?" he said quietly near her ear. "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." She turned her head to look at him. His face was close. There was no alarm in it, no performance of concern, just attention. Damien Russo paid attention the way other people breathed, as though it was simply the natural condition of his existence. "I didn't expect it to feel like anything," Emma admitted. "And it didn't feel like much, but it felt like something." "That's allowed." "I know it's allowed." "Then stop apologizing for it." "I'm not apologizing. You're explaining. It's the same thing with you." She looked at him for a long moment, and then despite everything, the tension of the last 20 minutes, the residue of Ryan's performance, the general weight of being in a room full of people who watched everything, she felt something loosen in her chest. "You're really irritating sometimes." "I know. You're also usually right." "I know that too." She turned back toward the room. She held her glass steady. She let herself stand in the space she had earned without shrinking from it. She had been doing this for years now, standing in spaces that used to feel too large for her, that used to feel like other people's territory. She had learned slowly, and then suddenly, and then with great certainty, that the feeling of not belonging somewhere was almost never about the space itself. It was about whose voice was loudest in your own head when you walked in. Ryan's voice had been loud in her head for a very long time. It was considerably quieter now. She found Priya at the edge of the reception area an hour later, tablet in hand, doing the quiet coordination that kept Emma's professional life from dissolving into chaos. "He asked about you," Priya said without looking up from the screen. "Who?" "You know who." Emma paused. "When?" "About 20 minutes after you came in, before he came over to you. He asked Marcus Holt. You know Marcus, he's on the Meridian board. He asked Marcus who you were now, what you'd been doing, who your husband was." Priya looked up. "He didn't know who Damien was, Emma. He walked over to you having no idea." Emma sat with that for a moment. "What did Marcus tell him?" Priya's expression shifted by a fraction of a degree, something between amusement and satisfaction. "The full name, the full context, everything." Emma thought about Ryan's face in the moment after Damien spoke, the degree of change in his eyes, the first distant awareness. So he had known by the time he made his joke about money and the right company exactly who Damien Russo was. He had made the joke anyway. "He came over knowing," Emma said. "Not quite a question. He came over knowing," Priya confirmed. Emma put that information somewhere she could think about it carefully later. "Okay. Are you okay?" "Everyone keeps asking me that tonight." "Because you keep looking like you're calculating something." "I'm always calculating something." "Fair," Priya said, and went back to her tablet. The keynote was 25 minutes of polished performance. Ryan at a podium, describing his philanthropic work with the particular mixture of humility and pride that very wealthy people had refined into an art form. He talked about giving back. He talked about seeing people who were invisible and choosing to see them. He talked about the responsibility of success. Emma sat at a round table in the third row and listened to every word. She thought about the voicemail she'd listened to in a hospital corridor at 11:37 at night, standing in fluorescent light with her coat still on, because she'd just gotten there. Just finished a 6-hour shift and ridden 2 buses to get to her mother's floor, and she'd played the voicemail because Ryan had been calling all week, and she'd kept missing it, and she genuinely thought that he was calling because he'd found a way to help. Because he'd said he would look into it. because he'd said he'd talked to his father about the medical costs, that there had to be something that he wasn't going to let her go through it alone. Emma, I've been thinking a lot. This situation, your mom, everything, it's not something I can be part of right now. My family has concerns. I think we both know this isn't going to work long term. I really do care about you. I hope you understand. She had stood in that corridor for a very long time after the message ended. She hadn't cried. She'd thought she should cry, had expected to cry, had prepared herself for crying, but it didn't come. What came instead was something colder and much more useful, a particular quality of focus that arrived when every option except forward had been closed off. She had gone into her mother's room. She had sat beside the bed. Her mother had been awake. She'd been watching the door the way she always watched the door, and when Emma came in, she'd looked at her face and said quietly, "He left." Emma hadn't asked how she knew. "Yes." "Good." "Mom, I mean it. Good." Her mother's voice was weak from the weak, but the conviction in it was not weak at all. "You were spending so much energy on a person who wasn't spending any on you. Now you can spend it on yourself. Now you can become what you were always going to become." "I don't know what that is." "Yes, you do. You've always known. You were just scared to take up that much space." Emma looked at her mother's face in the dim room at the IV in the back of her hand, and the monitors, and the institutional blanket, and she felt something shift inside her. Not a healing nothing that clean, but a kind of readjustment. A weight redistributing itself. She had taken up space after that. Carefully at first, then more deliberately, then with the kind of confidence that comes from discovering your own instincts are correct and your own judgment is sound, and that the opinions of people who abandoned you when you were inconvenient are in the long run not particularly worth your time. Ryan found her again after the keynote. Emma had expected this. Priya, who knew Emma well enough to anticipate most things, had positioned herself at a strategic distance with a look that said, "I'm here. I'm watching, and I will rescue you with a fabricated emergency call if you make the signal." "I owe you an apology," Ryan said. Emma looked at him. She did not offer anything, no encouragement, no reassurance, no helping him along. He pressed forward. "Earlier I think I came across as—" "You came across as what you intended to come across as," Emma said, "which means an apology is for my benefit, not yours. And you're not really apologizing for my benefit. So." He stopped. The rehearsed contrition dropped off his face, and underneath it was something rawer and less flattering, the face of a man who was used to the world bending slightly toward him and was currently encountering friction. "You're still angry with me," he said. "I'm not angry with you at all." And it was true, which she thought might be the most deflating thing she could possibly say to him. "Ryan, I genuinely don't carry anger about what happened between us anymore. I made my peace with that years ago. But peace doesn't mean I'm going to stand here and perform forgiveness for your comfort. That's not something you get just by asking. I'm not asking for, you're about to ask me to tell you that you made a mistake, but it's fine that we were young, that there are no hard feelings, that you're a good person who happened to do something unfortunate at a difficult time. And that might all even be true, but I'm not going to give it to you." She met his eyes directly. "That's not anger. That's just self-respect." Ryan stared at her. Something crossed his face that she'd never seen there before. She was almost sure of it. Something that looked very briefly, and then not at all, like genuine recognition. "You've really changed," he said finally. "No," Emma said. "This was always there. You just couldn't see it when I was struggling." Damien was talking with two men. Emma recognized one from the city's financial sector, one from what she politely described to herself as adjacent industries when she returned to his side. He wrapped up the conversation within 2 minutes, which was one of his particular gifts. He could exit any interaction with such easy finality that the other person usually didn't realize they'd been dismissed until he was already gone. "Second conversation," he said. He tried to apologize. Tried. "I wanted me to absolve him. I didn't." Damien was quiet for a moment, turning his glass in his hand. "How do you feel?" "Tired," Emma said honestly. "Not because of him. Just tired. I've been carrying a very composed face for 3 hours. Then we leave. The dinner hasn't started. The dinner doesn't need us. She almost argued. She recognized the impulse, the old habit of not inconveniencing anyone, of staying longer than she wanted, because leaving felt like making herself too important, like claiming that her needs outweighed the obligation. She had spent years dismantling that habit. She was still working on the last stubborn remnants of it. "Okay," she said. "We leave." Damien set his glass down and reached for her hand. Not dramatically, just as a fact, the way he did everything. As though the world's opinion of the gesture was genuinely not a factor in his decision to make it. They crossed the room together. Emma felt the attention follow them, had felt it all evening. The particular quality of attention that surrounded Damien. Wherever he went, compounded now by whatever calculations people were making about the two of them together, about who she was, about what it meant that a man who never brought his personal life into professional spaces had spent this entire evening with his hand near hers and his attention anchored on her. They were almost at the exit when Ryan's voice reached them, louder this time, a performance for a larger audience. "You know what your problem always was, Emma," he said it clearly, deliberately, to the room as much as to her. "You never knew your place. Some people are built for a certain kind of life. And no matter how much money or how many connections they acquire, you can always see the original underneath. Always." Emma stopped walking. She turned. Ryan was standing with his group again, his expression reconstructed into something that wanted to read as casual. Just an observation, just a man making a harmless point, but his eyes were doing something different from his mouth. His eyes were tight and waiting. The room was listening. Emma opened her mouth. But it was Damien's hand on her arm, not stopping her, not pulling her back, just present, and then Damien's voice, still quiet, still without any performance of anger. "You're right about one thing." Ryan blinked. He hadn't been addressing Damien. "Some people," Damien continued, "are built for a certain kind of life, and you can always see the original underneath." He paused. "What we're seeing underneath you right now is a man who is afraid." Another pause. Specifically afraid that the woman he abandoned turned out to be exactly who she always was, and that he is not. The silence was complete. Ryan's face went through several things in rapid succession, none of them flattering. Damien turned back toward the exit. He didn't hurry. He didn't look back. Emma matched his pace, and she felt in the clean air of that exit that something had been named that had needed naming for a very long time, not by her and not for her, but by someone who saw her clearly enough to say the true thing without dressing it up or softening it or making it about anything except what it actually was. They stepped outside. The night air was warm and carrying the smell of the bay. Emma exhaled. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. I had it. I know that too." She looked at him. "Then why?" Damien looked back at the hotel entrance, at the lit glass doors, at the silhouettes moving on the other side. "Because some people need to hear it from a direction they didn't expect," he said. "And because he spent the whole night trying to reduce you in front of people who should know better. Someone needed to say the other thing." He turned back to her. "It didn't have to be me. Tonight it was." The car arrived. Emma stood for one more moment in the warm night, feeling the residue of everything. The evening, the years before the evening, the woman she'd been and the woman she'd become, and the strange continuing miracle of being known by someone with no agenda attached to the knowing. Then she got in the car. And the door closed. And for the first time in a very long time, the voice in her head that sounded like Ryan Whitmore said absolutely nothing at all. Ryan Whitmore did not sleep that night. He told himself it was the champagne, 2 glasses too many, the way the evening had run long, the particular restlessness that came from a night that had not gone the way he'd planned. He lay in the dark of his Brickell penthouse and stared at the ceiling and told himself that Damien Rousseau's words in the Valentina ballroom meant nothing. That the shift in the room, the silence, the way people had looked at Ryan in the aftermath, the way conversations had found other directions when he'd tried to restart them, was something he was exaggerating in his memory. That by Monday, no one would remember it. He told himself all of this. He didn't believe a word of it. The problem with Ryan Whitmore. The thing he'd never been able to fix about himself, despite 37 years of practice, was that he needed to win. Not just succeed. Win. The distinction mattered enormously to him in ways he'd never examined closely enough to understand, but felt constantly like a pressure behind his sternum that only eased when the scoreboard was obviously in his favor. He had grown up in a family where everything was a competition, and winning was the only acceptable outcome, and he had absorbed that lesson so completely that it had become his architecture. It was the structure he lived inside. He had wanted everything for a long time. Emma Carter had been a part of that. Not a victory exactly, but a proof. Proof that he could choose who mattered and who didn't. Proof that he could make the hard decision, the practical decision, when sentiment threatened to become inconvenient. His family had called it maturity. He had called it maturity. He had been telling that version of the story for years at dinner tables and in quiet conversations, and inside his own head, at 11:30 at night when the other version tried to surface. The other version was this. He had left a woman who loved him because he was afraid. Not afraid of her poverty, not afraid of the inconvenience, afraid of the depth of what she felt, and the depth of what he felt in return, and what it would demand of him to be the person she needed him to be. It was easier to leave. He had told himself it was the right thing, the honest thing, the practical thing. But in the corridors of the Valentina Hotel, watching Emma Carter move through that room with the particular ease of someone who owned their own ground. Watching her stand in front of him and refuse to give him the performance of forgiveness. He'd come over to collect. He had understood for the first time clearly, and without the cushion of his usual self-narrative, that he had not made a practical choice 7 years ago. He had made a cowardly one. That realization had lasted approximately 45 seconds before his brain had built a wall around it and redirected his attention towards something more manageable. That something was Damian Russo. Ryan knew the name. After Marcus Holt had given him the full context, quietly precisely with the particular care of a man who understood that information like this needed to be delivered correctly, Ryan had spent 20 minutes rearranging everything he thought he'd understood about the evening. Damian Russo was not what he'd assumed. He'd assumed money connections, a man with influence in certain sectors of the city. That was all accurate as far as it went. It did not go far enough. Damian Russo was the kind of man about whom people spoke carefully, in rooms with closed doors, with one ear always angled toward the entrance. He was the kind of man whose business interests appeared on no public registry, but whose influence was present in every significant transaction in the city. He was the kind of man who had never been charged with anything, not because he was careful, but because the people who might have charged him understood on some biological level that this was not a worthwhile endeavor. Ryan had known all of this and had gone over to Emma anyway. At the time, something in him had calculated wordlessly in the manner of bad decisions made quickly that Damian Russo's reputation was exactly the protection he needed. That a man like that would not make a scene in public. That the code by which powerful men operated would hold the evening in a particular shape. That Ryan could say what he wanted to say to Emma in front of the people he wanted to hear it, and the worst that would happen was a cold look and a silent exit. He had gotten the cold look and the silent exit. He had also gotten Damian's words quiet and precise, and aimed with the accuracy of someone who had spent years understanding exactly where pressure needed to be applied, to be felt dropped into the middle of the room like a stone into still water. And Ryan had watched the ripples move outward through every conversation he'd tried to have for the rest of the evening. He had needed to win. He had not won. This was the fact he was lying with at 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, running calculations he didn't want to be running. His phone rang at 8:15. He picked it up without looking, assuming it was his assistant, and the voice on the other end was not his assistant. "I heard you had an interesting evening." His father's voice. Wallace Whitmore, 71 years, 3 divorces, and the particular authority of a man who had never once in his life allowed anyone to define the terms of his own story. "Someone sent me a photograph from that gala. You look like you're talking to a wall." Ryan sat up in bed. "Who sent you a photograph?" "People send me things. I've been receiving information for 50 years, Ryan. You know this." A pause. "Who is this woman?" "Nobody." "The wife of Damian Russo is not nobody. I've had dealings with Russo's people. Careful dealings. Deliberately careful. Another pause waited. You went over and picked a public fight with his wife. I didn't pick a fight. Apparently you did, and apparently you lost. His father's voice did not change temperature. I need you to tell me what this is about, entirely, now. Ryan stared at the wall. He thought about Emma in that hospital corridor, not a memory he usually permitted himself, and decided he would rather explain every other aspect of the evening before he got there. She's someone I used to date, he said. Years ago. I ran into her last night. I didn't know she was Russo's wife, and after you found out. The pause that followed was longer than Ryan intended. Ryan. His father's voice was very even. Tell me you walked away. It wasn't a scene. He spoke. A few words. A few words from that man, his father said, are the equivalent of a press release from anyone else. What did he say? Ryan repeated it as accurately as he could. His father was silent for almost 10 seconds, which was unusual for Wallace Whitmore, who processed information quickly and never needed long to decide how he felt about it. He's not wrong, his father said finally. Ryan blinked. What? About what he said. He's not wrong. A pause. I need you to leave this alone. Whatever you think you're doing here, leave it alone. I'm not doing anything. Ryan. His father's voice had the particular flatness of a man saying a thing he'd said before and had hoped he wouldn't need to say again. You've always needed to be right more than you needed to be safe. It's the thing I never managed to fix in you. For most of your life, it has cost you relatively little. This is a situation where it could cost you a great deal. The pause. Leave it alone. The call ended. Ryan sat with the phone in his hand for a long time. Then he put it down. Then he picked it up again and opened his contact list and found the name of a man who owed him 3 favors and who had on multiple occasions proved very useful for gathering information that was not publicly available. He told himself he was just looking. He told himself he wanted to understand the situation. He told himself it had nothing to do with winning. He called the number. Emma found out on a Wednesday. She was in her foundation office, not the corner office she'd eventually been offered downtown, but the one she'd kept in the building where they actually did the work, 2 floors above the intake center, where women came in carrying everything they owned, and the particular look on their faces of people who have survived something and are not yet sure whether survival was an achievement or just a delay. She was reviewing grant applications when Priya appeared in the doorway with an expression that Emma had learned to read accurately over 4 years of working together. Someone is asking about you, Priya said. Emma set down the application. Asking how? Systematically. Priya came in and closed the door. A man named Dennis Cole has been contacting former employers, former landlords, 2 people from your mother's care facility. He's asking general questions where you worked, what you were like, your financial situation 7 years ago. She paused. He's also been trying to access documents. What documents? Medical billing records, your mother's, from the county hospital. Priya's voice was careful and steady, which was the way she delivered things she knew Emma would find difficult. He hasn't gotten in, the hospital flagged it, but he tried. Emma was very still for a moment. She thought about her mother in that room. She thought about the bills, the stack of envelopes she'd kept in a kitchen drawer, and looked at every Sunday morning with the mechanical discipline of someone who refused to pretend the thing wasn't there. She thought about the $43 in her checking account, and the way that number had not left her memory in 7 years. The way certain numbers became permanent once they've been the number standing between you and disaster. When did this start, she said. 4 days ago. 4 days ago was the day after the gala. Emma held that fact and turned it over. She was not surprised. She recognized somewhere below surprise that she had known that when Ryan had said, "I almost didn't recognize you," and looked at Damien with those recalibrating eyes, something in him had made a decision. She had not known the specific form the decision would take. She knew now. He wants something to use, Emma said. That's my read. I wants a version of my history he can surface. Something that makes the story about where I came from instead of where I am. She put her hands flat on the desk. Something that makes Damien's association with me look like either charity or poor judgment. Priya nodded. That's what I think. Emma stood up and moved to the window. Below on the street, a woman was walking a dog in the thin November sunlight, and the dog was investigating something on the pavement with the total absorption of a creature who has no awareness of being watched. Emma watched it for a moment. She thought about the shape of what Ryan was doing and the architecture underneath it. Not rage, she didn't think, not quite. Something more specific than rage. The need to rewrite an evening that had not gone his way by changing the context around it. If he couldn't win on the night, he would win in the aftermath. He would find the thing that made her reducible and make sure it reached the right ears. She had been reducible before. She did not intend to be reducible again. Don't touch it yet, she told Priya. Emma, don't touch it. I need to think about how I want to handle this, and I need to tell Damien. Priya's expression shifted by a fraction. He's going to... I know what he's going to want to do. Emma turned from the window. That's why I need to tell him myself, and tell him first, so I can tell him what I want him to do instead. She told Damien that evening. They were in the kitchen of their home, not the formal space, the actual kitchen where Damien sometimes cooked when he needed to think, and Emma sat on the counter and did the reading she never finished during the day. It was a ritual they had settled into without ever deciding to the way the best rituals accumulate. She told him about Dennis Cole, and the former employers, and the hospital records, and the 4 days of quiet systematic excavation of everything she'd been before she became the person she was now. Damien listened. He did not interrupt. He did not change his expression. He kept doing what he was doing, a sauce something with tomatoes and wine, with the particular controlled attention of someone managing 2 things at once, both of them important. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. How long have you known? He said. Since this afternoon. And you waited until now to tell me. I needed to decide how I wanted to handle it before I talked to you, because I knew if I talked to you first, your version of handling it would take over the conversation, and I'd spend the rest of the evening managing you instead of managing the actual situation. He looked at her. His expression was the one that meant she was right, and he didn't particularly want to acknowledge it. What do you want to do? Nothing yet. Emma, he hasn't found anything yet, Damien. He's been trying for 4 days, and he hasn't found anything because there isn't anything. My history is not a scandal. It is a woman who was poor and had a sick mother and worked very hard and paid every bill she owed, and never once did anything she needed to be ashamed of. She kept her voice even. I'm not afraid of my history. I'm not worried about what he'll find. I'm worried about what he'll fabricate. She had expected this. She'd thought about it on the drive home. If he fabricates something, it's worse for him than for me. He's a public figure. He just gave a keynote about integrity. People with platforms absorb fabrications better than they absorb truth. I know that. So you know it's not nothing. I know it's not nothing. She met his eyes. But it's also not something we address by having Damien Russo's people pay a visit to Dennis Cole, which I know is currently your preferred response, and which would create a problem considerably larger than the one we have now. He was quiet. Am I wrong? She said. A pause. No. Then let me handle it my way first. If my way doesn't work, we can have a different conversation. He turned back to the stove. He stirred the sauce slowly, and she watched him work through something behind his face, the tension between what he wanted to do and what she was asking him to choose instead. This was the thing about Damien that had surprised her most early on. He was entirely capable of choosing her judgment over his instinct. He didn't do it automatically, and he didn't do it without friction, but he could do it. He had built his world on the principle that he knew best, that his read was right, that his methods were correct, and he was capable of setting all of that down when she asked him to. She thought that was the bravest thing about him. Okay, he said finally. Thank you. Don't thank me. Tell me when it changes. You'll be the first person I tell. He looked at her over his shoulder, and there was something in his face. Not softness exactly, but the close cousin of it. The thing underneath his certainty that she had access to and almost no one else did. You know, he said, Most people, when they find out someone is digging through their past, their first instinct is fear. I know. Your first instinct was strategy. Should I be apologizing for that? No. He turned back to the sauce. I'm just noting it. Emma settled more comfortably onto the counter. My mother used to say that fear is just information you haven't organized yet. Your mother was a very smart woman. She was the smartest person I've ever known. A pause. Present company included before you feel the need to contest that. I wasn't going to contest it. You were thinking about it. I was thinking that it's probably true. He added something to the pan, she didn't catch what, and the smell changed, deepened. She would have liked knowing you turned out this way. Emma felt something move in her chest at that unexpected and sharp, and then warm. She did know, for a while. She knew I was going to be okay before she stopped. She knew. Good, Damien said simply, and she understood, as she always did with him, that the simplicity was not absence, it was precision. He had said exactly the right thing, and then he'd stopped because he trusted her to take it the rest of the way. Dennis Cole's name appeared on Emma's legal team's desk the following morning. She had not put it there. She had not asked anyone to put it there. But Damien's world ran through channels that did not require direct instruction, and when she called him at 9:15 to tell him someone had already started pulling Cole's professional background, his voice on the other end was completely composed. That didn't come from me, he said. Then who? It came from people who work with me, who make their own assessments, who saw the same situation I saw, and came to the same conclusion about how it should be monitored. A pause. Monitored is all it is. Nothing has happened. Emma gripped the phone. Damien. Monitored, he said again. That's the word. I give you my word. She breathed. The moment it becomes more than monitored, you'll know before it does. She sat with that for a moment. She wanted to be angry about it on principle, about the intervention before she'd asked for it, the machinery moving without her instruction. She recognized, though, that the anger she was reaching for was largely about optics, about not wanting to be the woman who needed her husband's infrastructure to protect her, about the distinction between being protected because you're loved and being protected because you're considered helpless. She knew Damien understood that distinction. She also knew that what he'd said was true. It was monitoring, not action. He had held the line she'd asked him to hold. Fine, she said. Say it like you mean it. I mean it. A pause. I just don't love it. I know. I'm going to handle Ryan directly. I know that too. I'm going to call him today. A beat. Would you like me to be on the call? Absolutely not. Good. And she heard underneath the single word, the thing that passed between them constantly without needing language, the understanding, the recognition, the basic fact of being known. Call me after. Ryan answered on the second ring. He'd been expecting her. She could tell immediately the answer was too fast. The voice too composed, the particular quality of a man who has rehearsed his tone for an anticipated conversation. Emma, he said. You hired Dennis Cole, she said. No setup, no preamble, a pause, short but real. I don't know what. Ryan. She kept her voice level, not cold. Level. There was a difference, and she'd learned it mattered. Cold invited contest. Level left no room for it. I'm not calling to argue about whether you did it. I know you did it. I'm calling to tell you one thing, and then this conversation is over. Silence. Whatever you think you're going to find, she said, or construct or suggest about who I used to be, about my mother's medical history, about the years when I had nothing, you are welcome to it. Bring it wherever you want. Say whatever you need to say. She paused. And then understand that every single thing you find will be the story of a woman who survived something very hard and built something real from nothing. Every single thing you find will make you look like the man who walked away from her when she needed help and is now trying to punish her for not staying ruined. The silence on his end was different now. You're not going to find a scandal, Emma said. You're going to find the truth. And I promise you the truth is a worse problem for you than it is for me. She heard him breathe. She heard the particular texture of a silence that is actually a person recalculating. "I'm not trying to," he started. "Ryan." Her voice stayed exactly where she'd put it. "Don't tell me what you're trying to do. We both know, and we both know why." She paused. "I hope you find what you're actually looking for. I don't think it's in my past. I think it's in yours." Another pause. "Stop the investigation. Today." She ended the call. Her hands were completely steady. She sat for a long moment with the phone in her hand in the quiet of her office with the sounds of the foundation floor below. Her voice's movement, the specific noise of a place where real work was being done, and she felt something she recognized as resolution. Not completion. Resolution. The specific kind of peace that comes not from a problem being finished, but from knowing you've handled it correctly in the way that won't haunt you later. She thought about her mother's voice in the hospital room. "You can become what you were always going to become." She had been becoming it for 7 years. She was still becoming it. She thought that was probably the whole point, not the arrival, but the becoming. Not the day the thing was finished, but all the days of building it. Dennis Cole's activity stopped that afternoon. Priya confirmed it at 4:15 with a message that was 2 words. He stopped. Emma read it and set the phone down and went back to the grant applications on her desk. She did not call Damien to tell him. He called her at 4:22. "Priya told you," Emma said. "Priya tells me nothing. I have my own sources." A pause. "Good call." It was the right call. "It usually is," he said. And she heard in his voice the thing she had learned to hear. Not pride exactly, because pride implied ownership. And Damien had always been precise about that line. Something else. Something that sounded like "I see you. Exactly as you are. And it is more than enough." She had spent years learning to receive that without deflecting it. She was still learning, but she was better at it than she used to be. "Come home," he said. "I have 2 more applications." "Bring them." She looked at the stack. She thought about the kitchen, the sauce, the counter, the ritual that had no name but was one of the best things in her life. "I'll be there by 6, she said. "I'll have the wine open." She ended the call, gathered the applications into her bag, and stood up. Outside, the November light was doing something extraordinary to the tops of the buildings, hitting them at an angle that turned the glass briefly gold. The kind of light that lasted only a few minutes and only happened a few times a year. The kind you had to be looking at the right moment to catch. She was looking at the right moment. She caught it. Then she put on her coat and went home. Dennis Cole stopped. But Ryan Whitmore did not. That was the thing Emma had miscalculated. Not the call, not the words, not the way she'd delivered them. The call had been correct. She knew it had been correct. But she had made one assumption that turned out to be wrong, and it was the same assumption she'd made about Ryan 7 years ago, when she'd listened to that voicemail in the hospital corridor and thought, "This is finished now. I know what this is. I know where it ends." Ryan did not end where she expected him to end. He never had. The difference between a man who is embarrassed and a man who is humiliated is a matter of audience. Embarrassment is private. Humiliation requires witnesses. Ryan had been humiliated in front of 300 people. He had walked across a room with a performance prepared and been dismantled in public by a man who hadn't even raised his voice. And then he had tried to repair the damage through a quiet, deniable campaign, and that had been ended too by Emma herself in a 2-minute phone call where she hadn't even given him space to pretend he didn't know what she was talking about. 2 losses in a week. Emma had understood when she made the call that this might not be enough. That a man built the way Ryan was built might experience a clean, decisive conversation, not as a boundary, but as a provocation. She had understood it as a possibility and assessed it as unlikely. She had been wrong. She found out on a Friday morning 10 days after the gala, when her phone rang at 7:46, and the voice on the other end was not Priya, not Damien, not anyone from her professional world. It was a journalist named Claire Fontaine, who wrote for a financial and society publication that Emma read occasionally and respected moderately, and whose voice had the careful neutrality of someone who has already decided to make the call but is still deciding how to make it go. Mrs. Russo, Claire said. I'm sorry to call this early. I want to give you the opportunity to respond to something before we run it. Emma was already out of bed, already moving toward the window, already doing the thing her brain did when it received information. It needed to process, vertically. Standing up, grounding her feet, getting the blood moving. What is it? We've received a detailed account, Claire said, from an anonymous source describing your personal and financial history in some depth. The account includes, and I want to be transparent with you about this, claims that your marriage to Damien began under circumstances that your source describes as deliberately pursued for financial advantage. It characterizes your professional success as having been, quote, manufactured through your husband's connections. And it includes records. A pause careful, or what appear to be records relating to financial transactions from approximately 7 years ago. Emma was completely still. The records, Claire continued, and her voice had shifted by a degree that Emma registered something that sounded almost like discomfort, appear to show a series of payments made from an account associated with Damien Russo's holdings to accounts connected to your mother's medical care, prior to your marriage. The room was very quiet. Emma heard her own heartbeat. Then she heard something else, a name rising from her memory, like something that had been waiting. A specific piece of information she had received from Damien 18 months into their relationship, on a night when he'd told her something he described as the only thing he'd done without asking her permission first. She had been angry about it then. She had been angry for 3 days. And then she'd understood it, and the anger had transformed into something much more complicated. Mrs. Russo, Claire said, are you still there? I'm here. Emma's voice was steady. Can you tell me the records you received? How detailed are they? Very. Dates and amounts? Yes. Emma sat down. She sat down on the edge of the bed and put one hand flat on her own knee and breathed with the deliberate rhythm she used when she needed to think faster than her nervous system wanted to allow. She knew what those records showed. She knew exactly what they showed because Damien had told her had sat across from her in the early days of their relationship before they were married, before she'd understood the full scope of who he was, and had told her that he had done something 18 months before they'd ever met. That someone he trusted had brought her name to his attention. That he had looked at her situation, the hospital bills, the debt, the impossible arithmetic of keeping her mother alive on a waitress's income, and had made a decision she'd never asked him to make. He had paid her mother's medical bills anonymously, all of them, every month for 11 months, from the day a friend of a friend had mentioned a woman working triple shifts to keep her sick mother in a private facility until the day her mother died. Damien Russo, who had not yet met Emma Carter, who owed her nothing and had no reason in the world to do it, had paid for her mother's care, because as he had explained it to her very quietly on a night when she'd asked him the only question that mattered. Someone told me she was the kind of person who deserved one less impossible thing to carry. Emma had not known. Her mother had not known she'd believed the facility had a charity fund, which was what the administrative contact had told her when she'd asked why her balance kept showing as settled. And when Emma found out from Damien's own mouth, she had sat with it for 3 days and turned it over from every angle and asked herself what it meant and whether it changed anything and whether it was something she could accept without feeling as though her history had been quietly rewritten without her knowledge. She had decided finally that it did not change what she had built, that the bills being paid had not made her work less, had not made her decisions for her, had not taken anything from the woman she'd become. He had given her mother, and by extension, Emma, a single mercy in the middle of an impossible time, without expectation, without introduction, without ever intending to tell her at all. She had made her peace with it. She had also understood instinctively that it could be weaponized, and now it was being weaponized. I need a few hours, Emma told Claire, before you run anything. I can give you until end of business today. That's enough. Emma stood back up. Claire, I want you to know that I'm going to give you the full story, the real one, not a response. The actual story on the record with documentation. She paused. I think you'll find it's considerably different from what your source is implying. A beat. I'd like that, Claire said, and this time the careful neutrality had shifted all the way into something that Emma read as genuine. "I'll hold the peace." The call ended. Emma held the phone for exactly 4 seconds. Then she called Damien. He answered before the first ring finished. "I know," he said. She stopped. "You already know." "Someone on Claire Fontaine's staff made calls last night to verify the records. One of those calls went to a contact of mine." A pause. "I was going to call you at 8. It's 7:51. I was giving you 9 more minutes." She almost laughed. It was not funny, but the almost laugh came anyway, the way it sometimes did when things were bad enough that the absurdity of the situation became briefly indistinguishable from humor. "Did you know this was what he'd do?" "I knew he'd do something. This was one of 3 possibilities I had mapped. And the other 2? Less clean than this." She absorbed that. "He got the records from your holdings. He didn't get them legally." "What does that mean?" "It means someone inside one of my companies was paid to pull documents and hand them to Cole, who I assume handed them to Ryan, who I assume handed them to the journalist." Damien's voice was measured, but she knew him well enough to hear what was underneath the measure. A specific quality of contained anger that ran cold rather than hot, the kind that was considerably more dangerous than the hot kind. "The person who provided the records has already been identified. What are you going to do about it?" "What I need to do." His voice closed around that sentence. "That part is not something you need to be involved in." She started to push back, started to form the words, and then stopped. Because there were lines, and she had always known there were lines, and this was one of them. Damien's world had rules that predated her and would outlast her, and the enforcement of those rules was not something she had ever tried to reach into. It was not naivety. It was the specific, clear-eyed understanding that some things were his to carry, and some things were hers, and the marriage worked because they both knew the difference. "Okay," she said. A pause. He had expected her to push. "Okay. Okay." She moved toward the closet, the phone tucked between her ear and her shoulder. "I'm handling Claire Fontaine. I'm going to give her the full story, the real one, the payments, all of it on the record. I'm going to make it about what it actually was, instead of what Ryan is trying to make it. If you do that, I know what it costs. I've thought about it." She pulled out clothes, moved efficiently. "If the story comes out in Ryan's version, it's a scandal. If it comes out in my version, it's something else entirely. It's the truth. And the truth is actually fine, Damien. The truth is that a man who didn't know me paid my mother's medical bills because someone told him she deserved a break. And then 2 years later we met and fell in love the way people do. That's not a scandal. That's just a story." Silence on his end. "It's a good story," she said quietly. "Let me tell it." She heard him breathe. She heard him working through it the same way he worked through everything she asked him to trust her with, not instantly, not effortlessly, but genuinely. "You're certain." "I'm certain." "Claire Fontaine is fair," he said finally. "I've read her work." "So have I. If she gets it wrong, then we deal with that. But she's not going to get it wrong because I'm going to be in front of her in person at noon with documentation and 4 hours, and I'm going to make sure she has everything she needs to get it exactly right." Emma finished buttoning her shirt. "I need you to trust me." "I trust you." "Then let me work." He did something she recognized as him containing whatever he wanted to say next and choosing not to say it. "Call me after." "Always," she said, and ended the call. The meeting with Claire Fontaine lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes, not 4. Emma had brought the documentation. Damien provided the original transaction records, the name of the administrative contact at the care facility, a timeline that showed every payment, every date, every correspondence. She laid it on the table in Claire's office and told the story in the order it had actually happened, without softening and without embellishment. The way she had always believed the truth worked best, straight, unadorned, allowed to carry its own weight. She told Claire about the bills and the triple shifts and the $43 and the voicemail in the corridor. She told her about building herself back up from that point, the months of sleeping 4 hours a night, the first grant application she'd written on her lunch break, and the second and the third until one of them worked. She told her about the 2 years between Ryan leaving and meeting Damien, and what she had built in those 2 years alone, without help, without connections, without anyone opening a door. Then she told her about Damien. She told her about the payments, what they were, when they'd been made by whom, and the exact circumstances under which she'd found out. She told her about the 3 days of anger and what had resolved the anger. She told her that she would not sit in front of a journalist and perform gratitude. She hadn't felt that she had felt complicated things about a man making decisions for her life before they'd ever met. And that complicated was not the same as wrong. Claire listened. She asked 3 questions, all of them good, none of them designed to trap. She took notes. At the end, she looked at Emma across the table and said, "Can I ask you something off the record?" "Yes." "Why are you willing to make this public? The payments were anonymous. Your husband clearly wanted them to stay that way." Emma thought about that for a moment. "Because Ryan Whitmore is trying to use my mother's illness as a weapon," she said. "And the moment I allow that, the moment I stay quiet to protect myself from the discomfort of the story being told, I'm letting him turn her into ammunition." She paused. "My mother was not ammunition. She was a remarkable woman who got sick and needed help and was lucky enough to receive it. That's the story. I'd rather tell it than let someone else tell it wrong." Claire closed her notebook. "I understand." "I know you do," Emma said. "That's why I'm here." The piece ran 2 days later. Emma read it at her kitchen table early before Damien was awake, with coffee she'd made herself, and the particular quality of attention she brought to things she'd had a hand in shaping. Claire had written it with the specific precision of a journalist who understood that the most powerful version of a story was the one that let the facts speak without pushing them. The payments were in it. The timeline was in it. The real story of Emma's history, the work, the debt, the grief, the building was in it. Ryan's name was not mentioned. The anonymous source who'd provided the records was described only as someone connected to a recent public event, which was enough for anyone paying attention to understand, and not enough to give Ryan grounds for a lawsuit. The comments section, which Emma never read, was described to her by Priya at 9 a.m. as overwhelming and not in the way he planned. The calls started before 10. 3 board members of organizations Emma worked with called to say versions of the same thing, that they'd read the piece, that it had only increased their respect for her, that they were glad she'd told it herself. A woman who ran a competing foundation called to say that she'd been on the fence about a partnership proposal and was no longer on the fence. Damien's lawyer called to say that 3 individuals who had previously been uncertain about committing to a charitable initiative Damien was supporting had confirmed their participation. The story had landed the way Emma had believed it would land, if told correctly. She was in the middle of a call with the 3rd board member when Priya appeared in her office doorway, with a look that Emma did not recognize immediately. Something between alarm and a very specific kind of dread. The look of someone who has received information they do not know how to deliver. Emma ended the call. "What? Ryan is holding a press conference." Priya's voice was careful. "In 2 hours. His people released a statement this morning about 40 minutes ago. He's going to respond to the article." Emma was quiet for a moment. "What does the statement say?" Priya read from her tablet. "Ryan Whitmore will make a statement at noon addressing recent reports in the press and clarifying his relationship with the individuals involved. Mr. Whitmore believes the public deserves full transparency regarding the circumstances described." "Full transparency," Emma said. "That's what it says." Emma thought about what full transparency meant in Ryan Whitmore's mouth. She thought about what he might have kept, what documentation, what version of events, what angle he believed he still had available that the article hadn't closed off. She ran it quickly, systematically, the way she'd learned to run things when the stakes were real. Then she picked up her phone and called Damien. "I've seen it," he said immediately. "What does he have?" "We're working on that right now." A pause, and she heard voices in the background, low and rapid. 30 minutes. I'll have a full picture in 30 minutes. I need it in 20. 20, he agreed. She ended the call and looked at Priya. "Get my legal team on a call in 15 minutes, and get me everything we have on Ryan's company financial filings, anything public, Anything from our own records of his business dealings." Priya was already moving. On it. Emma stood up and went to the window. She stood with her arms folded and her eyes on the middle distance, and she thought about Ryan at a podium in 2 hours, with cameras and microphones, and the particular confidence of a man who had convinced himself he still had something to play. She thought about what he hadn't understood. What he had never understood about the difference between a story told from shame and a story told from strength. He had spent 10 days trying to find the version of Emma's history that would make her ashamed. He had found the payments and thought he had found it. He had handed it to a journalist and been outmaneuvered by the person he'd aimed it at, because Emma had taken the story and told it herself before he could. And now he was going to a podium, which meant he thought he still had something. Damien called back in 18 minutes. "His company," he said without preamble. "Whitmore Capital. He's been managing it publicly as a growth stage investment firm. Clean filings, good press, 2 years of positive coverage." A pause. What the coverage doesn't show is that 18 months ago, he made a series of investments through a subsidiary that he's kept very quiet. The investments went bad. Significantly bad. He's currently carrying debt that his public profile doesn't reflect, and he's been covering it by diverting operational capital from his main fund in ways that his investors don't know about. Emma's hand tightened on the phone. How bad? Bad enough that if it came to light, it would not be described as a business setback. A pause. It would be described as fraud. The word settled into the room. Emma sat with it. "He doesn't know that you know," she said. "No. And the press conference. He's trying to create noise," Damien said. "If he makes enough noise about you, about us, about the payments. He changes the story. He makes himself the source of the revelation instead of the subject of one. He's trying to flip the narrative before anyone looks closely enough at his company to find what's actually there." Emma understood it completely. She turned it over once, twice, confirmed it from a second angle, confirmed it from a third. "He's not attacking me," she said. "He's defending himself. He just doesn't want anyone to know that's what he's doing." "That's exactly what he's doing." She thought for a moment. "What do you want to do?" A pause longer than usual, and she understood why. This was the moment where Damien's version of handling things and hers would either align or diverge, and they both knew it. She had asked the question deliberately, not handed it to him but asked. Made it a conversation. "What I want," Damien said slowly, "and what I think is right, those are 2 different answers right now." "Tell me both." "What I want is to make sure he never stands behind a microphone again. What I think is right is," another pause, "that we don't touch his company directly. That we make sure the right people have access to the right information through the right channels, and we let it arrive where it's supposed to arrive without our fingerprints on the delivery." Emma was quiet for a moment. "You mean you want to let him walk into that press conference?" "Yes." "And let him speak?" "Yes. And make sure that by the time he finishes speaking, the people who need to be looking at Whitmore Capital are already looking." "The right people started looking 40 minutes ago," Damien said quietly. The moment his statement went out, Emma closed her eyes. She opened them. She thought about the women downstairs in her foundation, the ones who came in with everything they owned, and the particular look on their faces of people who have survived something. She thought about what it meant that a man with a platform and a podium could stand up and redirect a conversation away from his own wrongdoing by pointing at someone else's history, and how often that worked, and how much damage it did when it worked. She thought about her mother's voice. "You can become what you were always going to become." "Damien." Her voice was very steady. "I want to be at that press conference there. I want him to stand behind that microphone and look out and see me sitting in that room, and I want him to understand in that moment that I'm not afraid of what he has to say, that I never was." She paused. "I want to take the power out of the performance before he can use it." Silence. Then, "You understand that if he says something, I won't respond in the room, whatever he says. I'll sit there and I'll let him say it, and I'll let the cameras see that I'm not rattled. And then we go home." She paused. Can you trust me to do that? The pause was very long. She counted 8 seconds before he spoke. Yes, he said. On one condition. Name it. I'm in the room with you. She had expected this. She had in fact been counting on it. Agreed. She heard him breathe. I'll have a car there in 20 minutes. Make it 15, she said. I want good seats. The room Ryan Whitmore had chosen for the press conference was smaller than Emma had expected, an intimate conference space in a hotel downtown. Maybe 40 journalists' cameras positioned along the right wall. Emma and Damien arrived early enough to take seats near the center, visible from the podium, without being directly in front of it. Close enough that Ryan, when he walked in, would see them within the first 5 seconds. He walked in at 12:02. He was mid-sentence with his communications director when his eyes moved across the room, the automatic scan of a performer assessing his audience before he begins, and found Emma. He stopped talking. His communications director said something. Ryan didn't respond. He stood absolutely still for 3 full seconds, which was long enough for 2 of the cameras to swing in the direction of whatever he was looking at, and long enough for every journalist in the room to follow the cameras. Emma did not move. She held his gaze. Her face was composed, not cold, not aggressive, just present, just there. The face of a person who has decided that a room like this is not too large for her and is not bothering to second-guess it. Damien beside her was equally still. He did not look at Ryan. He looked at Emma the way a man looks at the only person in a room who matters to him. Ryan blinked first. He walked to the podium. He shuffled his papers. He looked at the room, and she watched him recalibrate in real time, watched him rebuild the speech inside his head, adjusting for the variable he hadn't anticipated. His communications director was watching him too from the side of the room, with the expression of a woman who is very good at her job, and is currently realizing the job just got significantly harder. Thank you for coming, Ryan said. His voice was practiced and steady. I asked you here today to address some recent reporting that I feel has created a misleading impression of. Emma kept her face exactly where she'd put it. She listened to him talk. She watched him find his rhythm and then lose it when his eyes accidentally tracked back to her, and then rebuild it and lose it again. A cycle that repeated 3 times in the first 4 minutes. She watched him try to find the version of the story that still worked with her, sitting right there, not angry, not confrontational, just there. Steady, real. The actual woman in the actual room, the version of her that no amount of selective documentation could reduce to a type or a narrative or a point he was trying to make. He got halfway through. His phone buzzed. He ignored it. He kept speaking. It buzzed again. His communications director's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Emma watched the woman's face change. His phone buzzed a 3rd time. He glanced at it. He looked back at the room. He looked at it again. Ryan Whitmore stopped speaking mid-sentence. The room noticed. A journalist in the front row leaned forward. Mr. Whitmore. Ryan picked up the phone. He read whatever was on it. His face went through 4 distinct expressions in approximately 6 seconds. Disbelief. Recalculation. Something that looked like genuine fear. And then the particular blankness of a man who is performing composure because the alternative is visible collapse. The SEC had issued a request for documents from Whitmore Capital effective immediately. The request had been filed at 11:58 a.m., 4 minutes before the press conference began. The timing was not an accident, and everyone in the room would understand that within the next 24 hours. Ryan looked up from his phone. His eyes went directly to Emma. She held his gaze for a long moment. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She didn't give him anything that could be read as a signal or a message or a performance. She simply looked at him with the calm, clear attention of a woman who had nothing to hide and nowhere she needed to be other than exactly where she was. Then she reached over and touched Damien's arm lightly. He was on his feet in one motion. They walked toward the exit, together, unhurried, the way they did everything as though the world's opinion of the pace was genuinely not a factor. Behind them, she heard the room beginning to fracture voices, the sounds of phones, a journalist already on a call, someone calling out a question that Ryan did not answer. They reached the exit. The door swung open. The air outside was cool and bright and smelled faintly of the bay. Emma exhaled. Damien did not say anything for a moment. He kept walking beside her, matching her pace. Then he said quietly, "You knew." "I knew the timing was possible," she said. "I didn't know it would be that precise." 11:58. "I wasn't expecting 11:58. She paused. "That was yours." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She thought about asking. She thought about the line and where it was, and whether this crossed it, and whether it mattered. She turned it over once. She let it settle. Then she said, "Thank you." He looked at her, and she saw the thing she always saw when she thanked him for something he'd done, from the part of himself he usually kept entirely private, the brief, unguarded quality of a man who is not used to being thanked and has not yet found a way to receive it gracefully. "Don't thank me," he said. "I know, but I am anyway." They kept walking. The city moved around them, ordinary and indifferent and continuous. The way cities were. The way life was pressing on, regardless of the private dramas playing out inside it. Somewhere behind them, Ryan Whitmore was standing at a podium in front of 40 journalists with a phone in his hand and a press conference he could no longer give. Somewhere ahead of them was a car, and home, and the kitchen, and the quiet. Emma kept moving toward it. She did not look back. The SEC request was public by 4 o'clock that afternoon. By 5:03, financial news outlets had picked it up. By 6, it was on the front page of every business publication that covered Miami's investment sector. By 7, Ryan Whitmore's communications director had issued a statement describing the inquiry as routine and cooperative, which was the language communications directors used, when nothing about the situation was routine, and cooperation was not yet a decision that had been made. Emma read the coverage from her home office methodically, the way she read everything beginning to end, no skimming, every word allowed to land before the next one. Damien was somewhere in the house behind her. She could hear the low register of his voice on a call he'd been on since they got back, the particular cadence of a man conducting business he'd rather conduct in private, and she'd given him the privacy without making it a thing. She thought about Ryan at that podium. She thought about this moment his phone buzzed, and his face went through those 4 expressions. The disbelief, the calculation, the fear. And she tried to examine her own response to it carefully. The way she examined all of her responses carefully, because she'd learned that the difference between a person who handled things well and a person who only thought they did was the willingness to look honestly at what you felt instead of what you wanted to feel. She didn't feel triumphant. She'd expected to feel something cleaner, the satisfaction of a person who has been wronged and then watches the wrongdoing absorb its own consequences. She knew people who felt that clearly, who could point to a moment of justice and say, "There, that's it. That's the thing I was waiting for." She had never been built quite that way. What she felt instead was the complicated, layered thing she always felt when something large shifted. Not happiness exactly, not relief exactly, but the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding a structure upright for a long time and has just been permitted to set it down. Her phone rang. Not Priya. Not Damien. The number on the screen was one she hadn't seen in 3 years. A Miami number, no name attached, but she knew it the way you knew numbers you'd called in distress. It was the direct line for Margaret Osei, who had been her mother's primary care nurse for the last 2 years of her mother's life, and who had, in the weeks after her mother died, been one of the only people who'd called Emma not to offer condolences, but simply to say, "Your mother talked about you every day. I thought you should know," Emma answered. "I saw the article," Margaret said without preamble. Her voice was the same as Emma remembered it, warm, unhurried, with the directness of someone who dealt with real things every day and had no patience for the performance of them. "The one that ran Wednesday. About the payments." Emma leaned back in her chair. "Margaret, I want you to know something." A pause. "Your mother knew." Emma's breath stopped. "Not at first," Margaret continued. "But toward the end, when her mind was clearest, you know how she'd have those stretches evenings, mostly where she was completely sharp. She asked me once about the billing, about why it kept coming back as settled. I told her what I'd been told to tell her the charity fund story. And she looked at me for a long moment And she said Margaret, who is actually paying for this. The room was very quiet. I told her I didn't know, Margaret said. Which was true. I didn't know the name. I only knew it was being handled. A pause. She was quiet for a while. And then she said, "Tell them thank you. Whoever it is. Tell them my daughter is going to be worth it." Emma put her hand over her eyes. She sat like that for a moment, not speaking. "I never got to deliver the message," Margaret said quietly, "because I never found out who to deliver it to, until I read that article." Another pause. "I thought you should know that she knew, and that she wasn't afraid of it." She said, "I'm remembering this exactly, because I wrote it down that same night. I used to write down things," she said, "someone with a good heart saw my daughter struggling and decided to help from a distance. That's not charity, that's grace. And I raised a girl who will know the difference." Emma's eyes were wet. She didn't try to fix that. She let it be what it was. "Thank you," Emma said, and her voice was rough with something she let stay rough. "Thank you for calling Margaret. I mean it." "She would have liked knowing it turned out this way," Margaret said. "She would have liked knowing you told the story yourself." After the call ended, Emma sat very still for a long time. She heard Damien's call finish in the other room. She heard the particular quality of silence that meant he was done for the evening, the way the house held differently when he wasn't speaking, as though the rooms reset around him. She heard him move toward her office and stop in the doorway. She didn't turn around. "You're crying," he said. "I know." He didn't ask why. He came into the room and pulled the chair from beside the bookshelf and sat in it close but not crowding, and he waited. She told him about Margaret, about what her mother had said. She told it in the order it had happened, and her voice broke once on the word grace, and she let it break and then kept going. Damien listened, the way he always listened entirely, without preparing his response, without reaching for her until she was finished, and the telling was complete, and there was nothing left to say. Then he reached over and took her hand. He held it without saying anything. She didn't need him to say anything. After a while she said, "My mother called it grace." "It was," Damien said, simply, finally. "You never told me why you did it. Really. You told me the surface version, someone mentioned her. You heard the situation, you decided to help. But that's the what, not the why." She looked at him. "Why?" I was quiet for a moment. She watched him consider it, not evading, genuinely turning it over the way he did when a question deserved the true answer and he was locating it. "I'd been a particular kind of person for a very long time," he said. "Effective, controlled. I'd built everything I had by understanding that sentiment was a liability and distance was protection. I operated at a distance from most things." A pause. "Someone told me about a woman working triple shifts to keep her mother alive. And something in me, something I'd kept at a very useful distance for years, moved." He looked at his hand around hers. "I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't know how to be in someone's life and actually help them. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I solved the solvable problem, anonymously, and then I left it alone." Emma looked at him. "And then 2 years later," she said. "2 years later, someone introduced us at a dinner I almost didn't attend, and you were arguing with the man next to you about housing policy, and you were completely right, and you knew you were right, and you weren't backing down an inch, and I thought—" He stopped. "What?" "I thought, this is that woman. This is who she became." A pause. "And I needed to know her." Emma held that for a long moment. She turned it over from every angle, the way she turned over everything, and what she found at the center of it was not a complication, but a simplicity. The simple fact of two people finding each other in the middle of lives that had already been shaped by forces they hadn't fully understood, and deciding anyway that what they were to each other was real. "I'm glad you almost didn't attend," she said. "So am I." He looked at her. Every day. Wallace Whitmore called his son that same evening. Ryan did not want to take the call. He'd been fielding calls for 4 hours. His lawyer, his funds management team. 2 investors who were calm in the particular way that people were calm when they were deciding how quickly they could exit a situation without being the first visible rat off the ship. He had given the same measured, confident responses to all of them, the responses his communications director had scripted, and the responses had been received with the silence of people who had already stopped believing them. His father's call. He took in his study, standing because Wallace Whitmore was not a man you received seated if you could help it. The SEC, his father said. It's preliminary. The SEC, his father said again, as though Ryan hadn't spoken. You went after Damien Russo's wife. You hired someone to dig through her history. You leaked documents to a journalist. And the SEC opened an inquiry into your company on the same day you held a press conference to try to redirect attention from all of it. A pause. Do you want to explain to me which part of this constitutes a plan? It was supposed to. It was supposed to what, Ryan? His father's voice was not raised. It was never raised. The absence of volume was its own form of pressure. It was supposed to make people look at her instead of at you. It was supposed to buy you time while you sorted out the capital problem. I know what it was supposed to do. I'm asking which part of it you believed was going to work, given that you were targeting the wife of a man who has more information about more people in this city than the FBI does. Ryan was silent. He knew about the fund, his father said. Before you walked into that hotel 2 weeks ago, Ryan, he already knew. That's how it works with men like that. They don't react to threats. They've already assessed them. You walked into his event with a plan to embarrass his wife, and by the time you opened your mouth, he had already mapped every version of what you might do and prepared accordingly. The pause was long. You weren't the threat in that room. You were the liability. Ryan sat down. His legs didn't make the decision consciously, they simply folded. What do I do? He said. His voice came out differently than he'd intended. Smaller. You call your lawyer. You cooperate. You stop. His father's voice had no comfort in it, but it had a kind of directness that was Ryan understood the closest thing to help Wallace Whitmore knew how to offer. And you accept that the woman you left in a hospital corridor 7 years ago is not the person you needed to defeat. She never was. You needed to defeat the version of yourself that left her there. A pause. That's the fight you've been losing since the beginning, and it has nothing to do with her. The line went quiet. Ryan sat in the silence of his study for a very long time. Emma did not know about that conversation, and she wouldn't for several weeks when Wallace Whitmore, through 2 intermediaries in the particular roundabout way of men who operated in the spaces between institutions, sent a message to Damien's office, expressing his intention to ensure his son's full cooperation with the regulatory process, and his personal assurance that the situation would not extend further in any direction. It was the closest thing to an apology the Whitmore family would ever produce. Damien relayed the message to Emma with the same minimal commentary he applied to everything that had already resolved itself correctly. She received it, sat with it for a moment, and said, "Okay. That's all? What else should there be?" He considered. Most people would want more than okay. Most people haven't spent 7 years learning how to set things down. She looked at him. I've set it down, Damien. Ryan, his father, all of it. I set it down the morning after the press conference. I'm not carrying it anymore. He was quiet for a moment. When did you set it down? She thought about Margaret's call, about her mother's voice through someone else's memory, clear and precise, and entirely her, the way she'd always been entirely herself, no matter what the circumstances tried to do to her. About grace. About what it meant when someone with a good heart helped from a distance and didn't need credit for it. When I found out she knew, Emma said, and that she wasn't afraid of it. Damien nodded. Once. The way he nodded when he understood something completely and had nothing to add to it. The Foundation's annual benefit was 6 weeks after the gala. Emma had been planning it for 4 months. The theme, the speakers, the fund matching campaign, she'd spent 2 weeks negotiating with 3 corporate partners who'd needed convincing and had eventually come around when she'd laid out the numbers with the particular patience she applied to things she believed in. The benefit raised money for women in crisis emergency housing, legal aid, medical access, the specific practical scaffold that someone needed when everything else had collapsed. She'd built the foundation on the principle her mother had articulated in that hospital room: everyone deserves one less impossible thing to carry. The night of the benefit. She stood in the back of the room while the opening speaker spoke. A woman named Diane, who had come through the Foundation's emergency program 3 years ago and was now running a catering business and raising 2 children in a home she'd rented herself without assistance, and who spoke about what it had meant to have one impossible thing lifted at the exact moment when she'd believed impossible was all there was. Emma listened to every word. She thought about the version of herself that had stood in a hospital corridor with $43 and a voicemail that ended everything she thought she'd been building. She thought about the morning after, the way she'd woken up and made coffee and looked at the bills and the number in her bank account and made a decision that was not conscious and not heroic and not anything except the only option available. She was going to keep going. She was going to keep going because her mother was still alive and still watching the door and still saying with whatever energy she had that Emma was going to be extraordinary. And Emma had decided somewhere underneath the grief of that night that she was not going to make her mother wrong about that. She had kept going, and here she was. Damien appeared at her shoulder at some point during Diane's speech. She felt him before she saw him, that particular shift in the air, the warmth of him nearby, the quality of attention he directed at whatever she was directed at. He didn't say anything. He stood beside her and listened. When Diane finished, the room applauded, and Emma put her hands together and felt the solid present reality of the sound around her. Real people, in a real room, moved by a real story, and thought about how long she'd believed that rooms like this were other people's territory. "She's remarkable," Damien said quietly. "She is. Reminds me of someone." Emma looked at him. He was looking at the podium, not at her, and his expression was the one she'd learned to read as the thing he said when he meant something entirely else, when the actual content of what he was saying was in the direction of his attention and not in the words themselves. She looked back at the podium. "Don't be sentimental," she said. "I'm never sentimental." "You're being sentimental right now." "I'm being accurate." He paused. "There's a difference." She almost laughed. The almost laugh came the same way it always came with him, unprovoked, irrepressible, the particular response of someone in the presence of the one person who reliably caught her off guard. "You're impossible." "Also accurate," he said. The room shifted around them. People moving, drinks circulating, the particular pleasant noise of a well-organized event running correctly. Emma's development director caught her eye from across the room and held up 3 fingers, which was the signal for the fund-matching campaign target being hit. And Emma felt the quick, bright flare of that genuine, uncomplicated clean, and held it. 3 times the target. She had asked for a third of what came in. She nodded at her development director and looked back at the room and thought, this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like when something you built from nothing becomes something real enough that other people trust it with their money and their belief and their need. She had been trying to explain this feeling to herself for years, and she still didn't have the perfect language for it. It was not pride exactly, though it was in the same family. It was closer to the feeling of a thing settling, of something that had been provisional becoming permanent, of an argument she'd been having with her own uncertainty finally coming to rest. Then her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. An unknown number. She almost dismissed it. She'd been dismissing unknown numbers for 3 weeks ever since the press conference because the press had found her contact information and used it with the particular persistence of people whose job was persistence. She looked at the number again. She recognized the area code. It was not a Miami number. It was a New York number, and something in her, the instinct she'd developed over years of reading situations, quickly told her to answer it. She stepped away from the room. She answered. "Is this Emma Carter?" The voice was a woman's, older, careful, formal, in the particular way of someone who has rehearsed the call. "Emma Russo," Emma said. "Yes. My name is Patricia Hale. I'm on the board of the Meridian National Foundation." A pause. "We've been following your work for approximately 18 months. The Carter Foundation's model, the Emergency Access Program specifically, has come up in 4 of our board meetings in the last year. As a program we believe represents a national replication opportunity." Emma stood very still. "We'd like to discuss the possibility," Patricia Hale said, "of a national partnership, funding infrastructure policy advocacy at the federal level." Another pause. I know this is an unusual way to reach you. I tried through your office and was told you were at your benefit tonight. I thought given the subject matter, it might be appropriate to reach you here. Emma looked back toward the room, toward Diane at the edge of the crowd, now talking with two other women laughing at something. The particular free laugh of a person who has survived something and landed somewhere safe. She looked at Damien, who was talking with her board chair across the room, and who caught her eye briefly, read something in her face, and tilted his head slightly. In a question she answered with the smallest possible shake of hers. Not now, I'm fine, give me a minute. He nodded, went back to the conversation. Mrs. Hale, Emma said, and her voice was steady and certain and exactly the voice of someone who has been building toward a moment for a very long time, without knowing that's what they were doing. Tell me more. She told Damien in the car on the way home. She told it the way she told him things straight from the beginning in the order it happened. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, the car was quiet for a moment. National, he said. That's what she said. Federal level policy. That's what she said. Another pause. How do you feel? Emma thought about it carefully. She thought about the $43 and the bills in the kitchen drawer, and the woman who had stood in a hospital corridor and made a decision to keep going. She thought about the foundation's first year, when she'd operated out of 2 rented rooms and 1 part-time assistant, and had chosen to believe that the model was sound, and the need was real, and that was enough to keep building. She thought about Diane's laugh. I feel like I owe my mother a conversation, she said. Damien was quiet for a moment. I think she already knows, he said. Emma looked out the window. The city moved past ordinary and lit and continuous. She thought about grace, about problems solved from a distance, about the particular non-heroic, entirely human act of keeping going. When keeping going was the only option, and what happened over time when you did. I think so too, she said. And she meant it. The car moved through the city, and the city held them, and ahead of them was home, and the quiet, and tomorrow, and every version of what was still being built. The foundation, the work, the marriage, the ongoing project of becoming the person her mother had always seen when she watched the door. Emma Carter had started with nothing and a hospital corridor and $43. She had built from there. She was still building, and there was nothing, no man, no performance, no press conference, no carefully curated document dump that could reach back and undo a single brick of it. She held Damien's hand in the dark of the car. The city kept moving. So did she. Patricia Hale's call was not a courtesy. Emma understood that within the first 20 minutes of their formal meeting, which happened 11 days after the benefit in a conference room in New York, that Patricia's assistant had booked with the particular efficiency of someone who understood that the person she worked for did not repeat requests. Patricia Hale was 72 years old, had spent 40 years moving money toward problems that mattered, and had the specific quality of attention that came from decades of sitting across from people who wanted things from her and learning very precisely how to distinguish the ones who deserved them from the ones who merely needed them. She looked at Emma across the conference table and said without preamble, I've read everything about you. The article, the Foundation's 5-year report, the press conference situation. She paused. I want to be clear, the press conference situation is part of why I'm sitting here. Not because of the drama, because of how you handled it. Emma kept her expression steady. How do you mean? You had 3 options when that story broke, Patricia said. You could have hidden. You could have fought. You chose to tell the truth in a way that made the truth the most powerful version of the story. She folded her hands on the table. That's not a communication strategy. That's character, and character is what I fund. Emma thought about the morning she'd called Claire Fontaine, about sitting across from a journalist with a stack of documents and the decision to tell everything, not because it was safe, but because it was true, and because truth told in your own voice was always harder to weaponize than truth told in someone else's. She had made that decision in a kitchen at 6 in the morning, still in last night's clothes, with Damien's coffee going cold on the counter beside her. It had not felt like character in that moment. It had felt like the only move available. I appreciate that, Emma said. But I want to be honest with you about what the national expansion means for the Foundation's current model. Scaling is not a neutral act. There are things we do well precisely because we're small, because we know our clients by name, because when a woman walks into our intake center, she talks to someone who has read her file and remembers it the next week. She leaned forward slightly. I'm not willing to build something large at the cost of building something hollow. So before we talk numbers, I need to know that you understand that. Patricia looked at her for a moment. Not surprised, not quite. But something in her expression recalibrated the way. Expressions did when a person turned out to be more specifically themselves than anticipated. That, Patricia said, is exactly what I wanted to hear. Emma kept her face composed and felt underneath the composure the particular clarity that came when a room aligned with her correctly, when what she was and what was being asked of her were not in tension but in accord. Then let's talk, Emma said. She called Damien from the lobby after standing with her coat unbuttoned and her phone warm in her hand, the particular restlessness of someone who has just finished something important and needs to process it in motion. He answered in one ring. How was it? She's serious. I know she's serious. I had her thoroughly researched before you walked in. Emma stopped walking. Damien. Background research, standard, not intervention. A pause. How serious? 40 million over 3 years. National infrastructure. A policy arm she wants to anchor to the foundation's model. Emma heard her own voice saying the numbers and felt the same slight unreality she'd felt sitting across from Patricia. The sensation of numbers that were too large for the person she'd been standing beside a hospital bed with $43 in her account. She had learned to sit with that sensation without letting it move her backward. She wants to announce at the Meridian National Conference in March. The pause on his end was short. That's 3 months. I know. Do you have the infrastructure for a public announcement in 3 months? No, Emma said honestly. But I have 3 months to build it. She started walking again. I need to hire 3 people immediately. I need to restructure the board. I need a legal team that can handle federal grant compliance, which is a different animal than state. She was running it as she spoke the way she ran everything forward problem to solution in the order the solutions needed to arrive. And I need to make sure that when we go national, the intake model doesn't get hollowed out by the scale. That's the non-negotiable. Then make it contractually non-negotiable. That's the plan. Good. She heard something shift in his voice, a warmth that he usually kept at a specific controlled distance from professional conversations, breaking through the way it sometimes did when she was moving the way she moved, and he couldn't quite keep the professional distance in place. Emma. What? You built this, all of it. I need you to let yourself hear that for a moment before you start the 3-month sprint. She slowed her pace. She thought about the 2 rented rooms and the 1 part-time assistant and the first year when the grant money barely covered the utility bills, and she'd been doing double duty as the director and the intake coordinator and the grant writer simultaneously because there was no one else. She thought about the 5th year when they'd served 400 families, which was a number she'd written on a piece of paper and looked at for a long time before it became real. She thought about Diane laughing at the benefit with that free full laugh. I hear it, she said. Do you? I do. A pause. I'll be home by 7. I'll have dinner ready. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said. That's the point. She ended the call and stood for a moment with the phone in her hand and the noise of the city around her ordinary indifferent continuous, and she let herself feel briefly and completely what $40 million and 3 years and a national platform meant to a woman who had once believed that forward was the only direction because there was nothing behind her worth returning to. It meant her mother had been right. It had always meant that. The news reached Ryan Whitmore on a Tuesday. He wasn't looking for it. He'd made a deliberate choice after the press conference, after the conversations with his lawyer and his father and the 2 fund managers who'd quietly withdrawn to stop monitoring Emma's trajectory. His lawyer had described this as prudent. His therapist, he'd started seeing one quietly in the weeks after the SEC inquiry formally opened, had described it as necessary. I was in his lawyer's office for a routine update when the notification came through on his phone. A news alert, the kind he'd set years ago for industry names that mattered. And apparently, he'd set one for the Meridian National Foundation at some point, because here it was, Carter Foundation announces national partnership. $40 million. Federal Policy Initiative. March launch. He looked at it for a long moment. His lawyer was saying something about document timelines, about the cooperation schedule, about what the next 60 days would require of him. Ryan heard it the way you heard sounds when your attention was entirely somewhere else, present as noise, absent as meaning. He thought about Emma in the hospital corridor. He had never actually seen her there. It wasn't his memory. It was a thing he'd constructed from the details she'd given him over months of a relationship he'd told himself was practical, and then discovered was considerably more than practical, at approximately the same moment he'd decided to end it. He had built the image over years, the fluorescent light, the coat she'd still be wearing, the phone in her hand, and in the version of the image his mind had refined over time, she looked like someone at the end of something. She had not been at the end. She had been at the beginning. He had understood this intellectually in pieces over the years. But sitting in a lawyer's office with the SEC inquiry in a folder on the desk and a news notification on his phone, he understood it the way you understood things that finally settled all the way to the bottom, not as information, but as fact. Permanent. Done. He put the phone face down on the table. "Ryan," his lawyer said. "Are you with me?" "Yes," Ryan said. "I'm with you." I was not with him. He was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that looked like a hospital corridor and felt like the particular weight of a decision that had seemed clean at the time and had turned out to be the opposite of clean. He stayed there for a moment. He let himself stay because his therapist had told him that the only way through the things he'd been avoiding for 7 years was through them, not around them, and he had been trying with the grinding difficulty of a person who had spent a lifetime going around to go through. He thought about his father's voice on the phone. You needed to defeat the version of yourself that left her there. That's the fight you've been losing since the beginning. He had been losing it for a long time. He was still losing it. The difference was that he was starting to understand the score. Emma did not think about Ryan Whitmore in March. She was too busy. The 3 months between Patricia Hale's conference room and the Meridian National Conference were the most compressed and demanding of her professional life. 3 new hires aboard, restructuring 2 rounds of contract negotiations that each took a week longer than projected a compliance framework. Her new legal team described as ambitious, with the particular tone of lawyers who meant borderline unreasonable, but will make it work. She was in her office before 7. Most mornings and home by 8 most evenings, and the 8 o'clock arrivals were only possible because Damien had quietly, without discussion, rearranged the back half of his own schedule to be home when she was home and away when she needed the space to work. She noticed it 2 weeks in and thanked him. He said, "You would do the same." She thought about it. "I would. I know." He'd looked at her with the level expression he wore when stating something that was not up for debate. That's why. The Meridian National Conference was held in Washington, D.C., in a ballroom that was by general consensus 3 times larger than it needed to be. Emma had learned over the years that the size of a room was often inversely related to the significance of what happened in it. The biggest rooms got the most careful performances, and performance was the enemy of the kind of change she was actually trying to make. She said as much to Damien in the car on the way to the venue. "Big rooms make people want to impress," she said. "I'm not here to impress anyone. I'm here to tell them what we're going to do and why it's going to work." "You'll do both," Damien said. "I don't want to." "Emma." His voice was patient and certain. "You will tell the truth exactly as you always tell it, and the room will be impressed because the truth is impressive. You don't control that part. That's not performance. That's just what happens when someone in a large room says something real." She looked at him. "You're being sentimental again." "I'm being accurate again." The line between those 2 things keeps moving. "No, it doesn't," he said. "You just keep hoping it will." She laughed. Actually laughed full and real, the way she laughed with him, and almost no one else. The laugh that came from being known well enough that the humor didn't need setup. She stood at the podium at 11:45 in the morning in front of 400 people who represented the institutional landscape of American philanthropy, and she told the truth. She told it in the order it happened. She started in Miami in a foundation with 2 rented rooms, and she described the intake model not as a program, but as a philosophy. The philosophy was simple. Everyone deserves one less impossible thing to carry. She had built every policy and procedure and partnership around that single sentence. She had hired people who believed it. She had turned away funding from donors who didn't. She talked about the women who had come through the program. She talked about Diane with her permission in detail. She talked about what it meant when practical help arrived at the exact moment someone needed it, and what it meant when it didn't, and the difference that difference made in the trajectories of actual lives. She did not talk about Ryan Whitmore. She did not talk about the gala or the press conference or the SEC inquiry. She did not talk about Damien's name or his world, or the way their marriage worked. She had made a decision months ago that the story she was telling was not the story of what she'd survived. It was the story of what she'd built. Survival was the precondition. The building was the point. Halfway through, she noticed the room had changed. It was subtle, the quality of attention, the way people were sitting, the particular stillness that came over an audience when they had stopped evaluating and started listening. She had spoken in enough rooms to know the difference. She had been in rooms where she felt the evaluation the entire time, the calibration, the assessment, the slow, continuous calculation of whether she was worth what she was asking for. This room had stopped calculating approximately 8 minutes in. They were just listening. She kept going. She described the national model, the framework her team had built over 3 months, the compliance structure, the way the intake philosophy would be preserved at scale through a training and certification program she'd designed with 2 of her best intake coordinators. She described the policy arm, the specific legislative gaps they intended to address, the 3 federal programs, whose eligibility requirements created barriers that had nothing to do with need and everything to do with bureaucratic architecture that had simply never been updated. She talked for 22 minutes. When she finished, the applause was not the polite institutional applause of a room fulfilling its social obligation. It was the real kind. The kind where people are hitting their hands together because something moved in them and they need to do something with it. Emma stood at the podium and let it land. She had learned to do that, to let the acknowledgement arrive without deflecting it, without performing humility or rushing past it. Her mother had been teaching her that lesson from a hospital bed without knowing. That's what she was doing. Stand in it, baby. You earned the standing. She stood in it. Patricia Hale found her 30 minutes later in the corridor outside the ballroom, where Emma had gone to breathe and drink water and let her nervous system downshift from the sustained pitch of the podium. 3 standing ovations at a philanthropy conference, Patricia said without preamble. I've been doing this for 40 years. I've seen 2. I wasn't counting, Emma said. I know you weren't. That's the 3rd. Patricia looked at her with the expression of someone closing a calculation they'd had open for a long time. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, not strategically. I'll try. Why philanthropy? Patricia said. You have the mind for corporate work. You have the instincts for politics. You could have built something that made you individually wealthy in a way that the foundation never will. So why this? Emma thought about it. She thought about the genuine answer, which she didn't always give in professional settings, because it was the kind of answer that made sophisticated rooms uncertain, too personal, too specific, not sufficiently architectural. But Patricia Hale had asked for honest. Because I was one of them, Emma said. I was one of the women who walked in with everything she owned, and the look on her face of someone who's not sure surviving was actually the goal. I know what it feels like to need one less impossible thing and not have it. She paused. I could have built something that made me wealthy, but I already know what it's like to have nothing. I know exactly how much weight it carries and exactly what lifts it. That's not information I can justify using only for myself. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Your mother would be proud, she said. Emma felt the familiar sharp warmth of that unexpected, and then present the way it always came when someone said her mother's name with the weight it deserved. She didn't deflect it. She didn't qualify it. I know she would, she said. I think about that every day. The announcement went public that afternoon. By evening, Emma's phone had received more messages than she could read in a single sitting. Colleagues, board members, journalists who wanted follow-up, women who had gone through the Foundation's program and had somehow found her direct number and sent messages that ranged from 1 sentence to 3 paragraphs, all of them saying versions of the same thing. She read every one. Damien found her on the hotel room bed, surrounded by her phone and her laptop and a half-eaten room service order, reading, with the particular absorption of someone who has decided that this is the task and everything else can wait. He sat in the chair across from her and watched her read without interrupting. After a while, she looked up. Did you eat? I ate an hour ago. Was it good? Acceptable. He paused. How are you doing? She thought about the question carefully because Damien asked it carefully and deserved a careful answer. I'm good, she said. I'm good. Not, I'm fine. Not, I'm managing. I'm good. I know. I know you know. I'm saying it out loud because I want to. She looked at him. I spent a lot of years not saying it out loud because it felt like tempting something. Like if I said I was good, some accounting would happen and something would be taken. She set her phone down. I don't feel that anymore. Damien looked at her for a long moment with the expression she'd come to understand as his version of what other men showed, with a great deal more noise. Everything he felt about her held very still, directed entirely in her direction, as present and as certain as anything she'd ever been given. Good, he said. She reached across and took his hand. He let her take it, folded his fingers around hers with the easy certainty of a man who had long since stopped treating the gesture as a thing that needed to be decided. I want to call Priya, Emma said. And then I want to sleep for approximately 9 hours. Call Priya. Then sleep, in that order. You're bossy when you're tired. I'm precise, he said. There's a difference. The line between those two things also keeps moving. He almost smiled. No, it doesn't. She called Priya, who answered immediately, despite the hour, and said 3 words. I saw. Congratulations. And then, before Emma could respond, added, Sleep. We talk tomorrow. And hung up. Emma looked at the phone. She hung up on me. She's efficient, Damien said. It's why you hired her. Emma set the phone on the nightstand and lay back and looked at the ceiling, and for the first time in 3 months, she let herself simply be horizontal, without a task attached to the position. The ceiling was ordinary. The room was quiet. Damien moved to the other side of the bed and sat on the edge of it, and she heard him removing his watch, the small familiar sounds of the end of a day, and she thought about how much she trusted the sounds of him, the specific vocabulary of his presence in the spaces they shared, the way his versions of quiet were legible to her now in ways that had taken years to learn, and that she would not trade for anything. Damien, she said. Thank you. She turned her head to look at him. For everything, the whole thing, the beginning of it, the middle of it, tonight, all of it. He looked at her steadily. He did not say, don't thank me, which was what he usually said. He looked at her and said, You're welcome. The directness of it, the simple, complete receiving of what she'd offered, made something ease in her chest that she hadn't realized was still holding. Go to sleep, he said. I'm going. She closed her eyes. The city was outside, lit and moving and indifferent, and in the morning there would be calls and plans, and the beginning of the next phase of something she'd built from a corridor and a voicemail, and $43, and the absolute refusal to let the arithmetic of a single terrible night define the sum of her life. But tonight, there was just this. The quiet room. The man she loved, who had seen her clearly from the beginning, and had never once asked her to be smaller than she was. The knowledge that somewhere in the world there were women who would walk through a door next week, carrying everything they owned, and find on the other side of it exactly one less impossible thing to carry. She slept. 6 months after the Washington announcement, Ryan Whitmore quietly settled with the SEC. The terms were not public, but the financial press described them as significant. His fund was restructured under independent oversight. His public profile, once carefully maintained and aggressively managed, went quiet in the way that profiles went quiet when the person behind them had run out of narrative. He did not contact Emma. She did not contact him. There was nothing left to say between them, and they both knew it. He, from the particular exhaustion of a man who had finally stopped fighting the wrong battle, and she, from the particular clarity of someone who had set something down a long time ago and had no intention of picking it back up. The Carter Foundation opened its first 3 national intake centers in September: Atlanta, Chicago, Houston. Each one built on the model Emma had refined over 5 years in Miami. Each one staffed by people who had been trained by her original team. Each one operating on the philosophy that was also the mission statement. And also, though it didn't say this anywhere in the official materials, the thing her mother had told her from a hospital bed with an IV in the back of her hand. Everyone deserves one less impossible thing to carry. The 4th center opened in Miami in November, 2 blocks from the original foundation office, in a building that was considerably larger than 2 rented rooms. Emma cut the ribbon herself. Damien stood beside her, not in front of her, not behind her, exactly beside her, which was where he had always stood, and which was, she had decided, the best possible definition of what they were to each other. The local press covered it. One photographer caught a moment, not staged, not arranged, the kind of moment that happened between people who weren't performing for anyone, where Emma had turned to say something to Damien, and he was already looking at her, and the expression on his face was not the one the city knew. It was the private one, the real one, the one that had no management or calculation in it, and was simply the face of a man who loved a woman completely and was not bothering to contain it. The photograph ran in the community section, not the front page. Emma kept a copy on her desk. Not the one of the ribbon cutting, not the formal one, where she was shaking hands with the city commissioner and looking appropriately official. The one with Damien looking at her like that. The one where nothing was performed and nothing was managed, and the whole story of what they were to each other was visible in a single unguarded moment. She kept it because it was true, and the truth she had learned, told plainly in your own voice in the order it actually happened, was always the most powerful version of any story. She had been a poor waitress in a corridor with $43 and a voicemail that ended the future she thought she had. She had kept going. She had built something real from nothing, and then built something larger from something real, and she had done it without bitterness, and without apology, and without ever once allowing the opinion of a man who left her when she was inconvenient to determine the shape of the life she was going to live. Ryan Whitmore had walked across a ballroom to remind her where she came from. He had reminded the wrong woman. Because Emma Carter. Emma Russo knew exactly where she came from, had never been ashamed of it for a single day, and had spent every year since the corridor building. Something so undeniable that no version of the past could diminish it. She had come from struggle. She had built from truth. And she had become in the end exactly who her mother always knew she was.